What if I told you that some of the deadliest weapons during slavery weren't guns or whips, but the very food served at the master's table? Welcome back. Before we dive into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we're about to uncover a piece of history that rarely gets told. This is the story of how enslaved women turned their kitchens into battlegrounds, and how poison became their secret weapon of resistance. Picture this. It's June 29, 1755. A wealthy ship captain in Massachusetts named John Codman sits down for his usual breakfast. His enslaved cook, a woman named Phyllis, has prepared his morning oatmeal just like she does every day. He eats it without a second thought. 2 days later, he's dead. But this wasn't just some tragic illness or bad food. This was murder. Deliberate, calculated, planned murder that had been 2 years in the making. And Phyllis didn't act alone. 2 other enslaved people, a woman named Phoebe and a man named Mark, had been slowly poisoning Captain Codman for 2 entire years. They used arsenic. They used rat poison. They used potter's lead. Week after week, meal after meal, they fed him death in small doses. When the truth came out, Mark was hanged. Phoebe somehow escaped conviction. But Phyllis? She was sentenced to be burned alive at the stake. Let that sink in for a moment. Burned alive. That's how terrified white slaveholders were of enslaved women who fought back. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Phyllis wasn't alone. She wasn't even unusual. Between 1681 and 1865, dozens of black enslaved women were executed for the murder or attempted murder of white people. And poison? Poison was their weapon of choice. Now you might be wondering, why poison? Why not run away? Why not fight with weapons? Well, think about it. Enslaved women, especially those who worked in the house, had no legal rights whatsoever. They couldn't go to the police. They couldn't sue in court. If they tried to physically fight back, they'd be killed on the spot. If they ran away, they'd be hunted down by dogs and dragged back to face unimaginable punishment. But poison? Poison was different. Poison was silent. Poison was slow. Poison looked like natural illness. And most importantly, enslaved women who worked as cooks and caregivers had access to it. See, there's this myth that working in the big house was somehow better than working in the fields. Like being close to the white family was some kind of privilege. But that's a lie. Being in the house meant being subjected to more constant, more intimate forms of violence. It meant being watched every single moment of every single day. It meant being within arm's reach when a mistress flew into a rage. It meant being sexually assaulted by masters who saw you as property. For enslaved women, working in the house wasn't a mercy. It was a different kind of hell. But there was one advantage. Knowledge. Many enslaved women had been taught by older healers about plants and herbs. Some that could cure, and some that could kill. Belladonna. Hemlock. Jimsonweed. Manchineel root. These women knew which plants could sicken the body, cloud the mind, and kill without anyone suspecting foul play. This knowledge had been passed down through generations, carried from Africa, whispered in the quarters late at night when the masters were asleep. Let me tell you about another case. This one happened in Mississippi in 1857. A woman named Josephine had just been purchased by a man named Lafayette Jones. 2 days after he bought her, Lafayette sexually assaulted her before heading back to Mississippi. When he finally returned home with Josephine, he installed her as the family cook. Now, the Jones family, Lafayette, his second wife Eliza, and their infant daughter Lelia Virginia, they all became violently ill right after drinking tea that Josephine had served them. The oldest child, a son, and their dinner guests didn't drink the tea, and they didn't get sick. Coincidence? The authorities didn't think so. Little Lelia Virginia died. Josephine and another enslaved person named George were put on trial for murder by poisoning. The case dragged on for 4 years. 4 years of trials and mistrials. And here's the thing, they were eventually found not guilty. But think about what Josephine had to endure during those 4 years. Think about the fact that she had been sexually assaulted by the man accusing her. Think about how her entire fate rested in the hands of a legal system that didn't even recognize her as fully human. Now let's talk about Sarah Bassett, also known as Sally. She was an elderly enslaved woman in Bermuda who was accused in 1730 of poisoning 3 people. Her own granddaughter, a girl named Beck, was forced to testify against her in court. According to the trial records, Sarah had visited Beck at the home of her enslavers, a white couple named Thomas and Sarah Foster. She allegedly brought various substances, including ratsbane, manchineel root, and something called white toad. She supposedly gave Beck specific instructions on how to poison the Fosters and another enslaved woman named Nancy. But here's where it gets interesting. Nancy found the poison and told the Fosters. When the trial began, 10 white citizens testified against Sarah, including Sarah Foster herself, one of the supposed victims. Beck testified that her grandmother had made her do it. Sarah denied everything. But it didn't matter. She was found guilty and sentenced to be burned alive. The Chief Justice asked if she had any statement that could change her sentence. She said she never deserved it. His response? You are to be fastened to a stake and burned with fire until your body be dead. Sarah Bassett was burned alive at a busy intersection by Hamilton Harbor. They made it public. They made it a spectacle. They wanted every enslaved person in Bermuda to see what happened when you fought back. But here's what's powerful. Today, there's a 10-foot bronze statue of Sarah Bassett in Bermuda. It's the first monument that nation ever erected to an enslaved person. And the national flower of Bermuda? Local legend says it first grew from Sarah Bassett's ashes at the site of her execution. It's described as quite hardy, able to survive in challenging environments. Tenacious. Adaptable. Just like Sarah herself. Let me tell you one more story. This one's from Tennessee in 1853. There was a woman named Louisa who worked as a seamstress in the big house. She had been sold south from North Carolina, torn away from her family as a teenager. She had uncommon skill with a needle, neat stitches, quick hands, an eye for detail. So instead of being sent to the fields, she was kept in the sewing room. But Louisa had learned something from an older woman named Bet, a healer among the enslaved. She had learned about plants. And she had learned how to soak thread in poison. How to weave death directly into cloth. By late summer, the entire plantation was in chaos. The children were wasting away in their beds. The mistress was screaming through blistered lips. The master was thrashing against his sheets, fighting demons no one else could see. Even the plantation doctor started noticing strange things. Some of the garments looked oddly stained. A bitter smell clung to the fabric, faint but undeniable. The overseer grew suspicious. His eyes turned toward Louisa. But what proof could there be? She was quiet, obedient, always working. Her eyes never revealed what her hands had done. Among the enslaved, rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed Louisa was a conjure woman, a practitioner of secret powers. Others believed she was protected by spirits, that no white man could punish her. We don't know exactly what happened to Louisa in the end. Some accounts say she was never caught. Others say she disappeared one night and was never seen again. But for generations, her story was told in hushed voices. Among black families, she was remembered as a rebel, a woman who fought back with the only weapon she had. Now, I want to be clear about something. These women weren't acting out of blind rage or impulsive anger. This wasn't some stereotype of a violent, angry black woman. These women were intellectuals. They were philosophers. They thought deeply about concepts like freedom and justice. They understood that anybody who participated in the system of enslavement, who denied them humane treatment, who bought and sold human beings, was part of the problem. And they made calculated, deliberate decisions about how to respond. Think about it. These were women who couldn't read or write in most cases. Women who had been told their entire lives that they were property, not people. But they crafted their own philosophy of justice that had nothing to do with how white slaveholders defined justice. In fact, they had a keener sense of justice on a humane and human level than the society that enslaved them. They understood something that their oppressors refused to acknowledge, that every human being has the right to defend themselves, to fight for their freedom, to resist their own destruction. The white legal system at the time saw these acts as the ultimate crime. Murder of a master was seen as a threat to the entire social order. That's why the punishments were so extreme. Burning at the stake. Public hangings. These weren't just executions, they were terror tactics designed to keep other enslaved people from getting the same ideas. But here's what the slaveholders didn't understand. You can't terrorize people who have already lost everything. You can't threaten people who are already living in hell. And let's talk about the fear these women inspired. By the late 1720s in Bermuda, the elite were making constant claims about being victims of poison attacks by their slaves. In Charleston, South Carolina, as early as 1755, enslaved women were being burned at the stake for poisoning their masters. In Missouri in 1850, an entire family was poisoned when an enslaved woman laced their coffee with arsenic. At Fort Riley, 2 enslaved women were accused of poisoning an ordnance sergeant. They were interrogated, tortured, until authorities finally decided they were innocent. But the damage was done. The fear was planted. Whenever unknown or unfamiliar ailments suddenly struck white slave owners, enslaved cooks would be suspected from the outset. It got to the point where some masters were afraid to eat food prepared by their own slaves. Think about the irony of that. These people had created a system where their own survival depended on the obedience of people who despised them. They had placed the people they oppressed in charge of their food, their children, their most intimate daily needs. And then they were shocked, absolutely shocked, when some of those people used that position to fight back. There's another dimension to this that's important to understand. Poisoning wasn't just about killing individual oppressors. It was about disrupting the reproduction of slavery itself. Some enslaved women poisoned the children of their masters. In 1769, a slave woman in South Carolina poisoned her master's infant daughter. There's a story from the Myrtles plantation in Louisiana about a woman named Chloe who baked oleander into a birthday cake. She allegedly only meant to make the children sick but used too much poison and killed multiple members of the family. True or not, these stories represent white slaveholders' worst nightmare, that the very people entrusted with caring for their children might harm them instead. And then there were the women who killed their own children. This is a complicated, painful part of the history. But we have to talk about it. Some enslaved mothers made the devastating choice to end their own children's lives rather than see them grow up in slavery. This wasn't about not wanting their children. This was about loving them so much that they couldn't bear to see them suffer the way they had suffered. It was about robbing slaveholders of future labor. It was about ensuring that their children would never experience the trauma, the abuse, the involuntary servitude that defined enslaved life. The most famous case of this is probably Celia, a slave in Missouri. In 1850, when she was just 14 years old, a man named Robert Newsom purchased her. He raped her on the way home. For 5 years, he continued to rape her repeatedly. Celia had tried everything. She approached other members of the Newsom family, begging them to make him stop. No one helped her. On June 23, 1855, Newsom told Celia he was coming to her cabin that night. She was 19 years old. She'd been enduring this for 5 years. That night, when Newsom came to her cabin and advanced toward her, Celia grabbed a stick and struck him over the head. He groaned and sank down. She hit him again. He died. Celia spent the next hour or so trying to figure out what to do. Finally, she decided to burn Newsom's body in her fireplace. She built a raging fire and pushed his corpse into the flames. When authorities eventually found her, they threatened her. They said they'd take her children away. They said they'd hang her. She eventually confessed. Her defense attorneys argued that she had the right to defend herself from sexual assault just like any white woman would. The jury didn't buy it. Celia was found guilty and hanged. She was 19 years old. These stories are difficult. They're brutal. They're horrifying. And some people might ask, why are we talking about this? Why are we highlighting these acts of violence? Here's why. Because these women have been erased from history. When we talk about slave resistance, we talk about men. We talk about Nat Turner's rebellion. We talk about Denmark v.C. We talk about the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman, which is important, but it's not the whole story. We don't talk about the women who fought back in their own ways. The women who used the weapons available to them. The women who turned acts of caring, cooking, sewing, nursing, into acts of war. We also don't talk about them because these stories make us uncomfortable. They challenge the narrative that enslaved people were passive victims. They challenge the idea that resistance has to look a certain way, has to be noble or heroic in a way that makes us feel good. These women weren't saints. They were survivors who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. They were human beings fighting for their lives, their dignity, their very humanity in a system designed to strip all of that away. And here's the thing that often gets overlooked. These acts of resistance, poisoning, fighting back, even taking their own lives or their children's lives, they weren't carried out with the expectation that they would lead to freedom. These women knew they probably weren't going to escape slavery. They knew they probably weren't going to overthrow the system. What they were doing was making their lives in the immediate moment more bearable. They were asserting their humanity. They were saying, you may own my body, but you don't own my will. You don't own my mind. You don't own my soul. That's resistance. Not just the big rebellions that made it into the history books, but the daily, constant, exhausting work of maintaining your sense of self in a system designed to destroy it. The work of caring for your children knowing they'll be sold away. The work of preparing food for people who see you as less than human. The work of surviving day after day when everything around you is designed to break you. And sometimes, when the opportunity presented itself, when the knowledge was there, when the desperation became too much, some women fought back. They used poison. They used fire. They used their bare hands. They used whatever they had. We need to remember these women. Not because what they did was easy or comfortable to think about, but because they were real. They existed. They resisted. They refused to accept the fate that had been forced upon them. They were Phyllis and Phoebe, who spent 2 years slowly poisoning their master. They were Josephine, who was accused of poisoning the man who had assaulted her. They were Sarah Bassett, who was burned alive but is now remembered with a statue and a flower that grows across her homeland. They were Louisa, who allegedly sewed poison into the clothes of the family that enslaved her. They were Celia, who killed the man who had raped her for 5 years. And they were countless others whose names we'll never know, whose stories were never recorded, whose resistance was carried out in silence and secrecy. These women deserve to be remembered. Not as villains. Not as victims. But as warriors who fought with the only weapons they had. As philosophers who crafted their own sense of justice in a world that denied them any. As human beings who refused to accept that their lives and their bodies belonged to anyone but themselves. So the next time someone tries to tell you that enslaved people were passive, that they accepted their fate, that resistance was rare, you remember these women. You remember that the most feared weapon during slavery wasn't always a gun or a sword. Sometimes it was the food on the master's table. Sometimes it was the clothes on the master's back. Sometimes it was the quiet determination of a woman who decided that enough was enough. If this story opened your eyes to a part of history you didn't know, hit that like button and share this video. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. And subscribe because we're going to keep uncovering these untold stories, these hidden histories, these truths that make some people uncomfortable but that we all need to know. Until next time, remember, history isn't just what happened. It's who gets to tell the story. And today, we're telling theirs.